These are all hymns to the Assyrian gods by looks of it. And some Hebrew hymns recognise the existence of the gods and asserting the absolute superiority of Yahweh. Comparisons between the Assyrian hymns and the Hebrew hymns in the book of Psalms. Glory of his name. Assyrian and Hebrew hymns are alike in that both exalt the name of deity, for both the name of the God is great and glorious and to be feared. It is known in all the earth and is not to be forgotten. There seems to have been an element of mystery, possibly due to magic, attached to the name of the Assyrian deity. Supreme God in his dwelling place. The Assyrians are known to readers of the Old Testament as worshippers of the hosts of heaven, and while the hymns represent them as adoring also the atmospheric gods, and furthermore finding deity not only in the heights above but also in the depths beneath. Nevertheless, their reverent gaze was most frequently turned skyward. Their gods were mainly gods of heaven and were associated at times almost to the point of identification with the heavenly bodies. Thus the god Shamash bears the name of sun and is unmistakably and very closely associated with the solar orb. Some examples there. And then some of the Psalms. A lot of information here. You can read it in your own time, at your own leisure. Lots and lots of hymns here. The Supreme God is the Creator. This creation is probably to be understood in a physical sense, for which there are many parallels in polytheistic religions, but no parallel in the Hebrew hymns. On the other hand, the phraseology of the following passages that I, Asher, have named you to lordship over land and men is entirely similar to Hebrew usage. Here the creation of God and King is equivalent to nomination or appointment. Similarly, Yahweh appoints a king over Zion. And in Psalms 82:6, although it is not said that Yahweh creates or begets the gods, yet it seems to be his fiat, his decree, that calls them into being. It is a question of secondary importance whether the Elohim is here to be interpreted as actually gods or judges. In either case, there is a similarity in Assyrian and Hebrew usage. The Hebrew hymnists also believed that Yahweh created mankind, and they marveled at the perfection of man's body. For I am fearfully and wonderfully made. The Supreme God is the God of nature. The supreme God is wise, powerful, and merciful. From the works of God in creation and nature, the hymnist passes readily and naturally to the thought of God's wisdom. The Assyrian hymns in many passages extol the wisdom of God, but wisdom as one might expect in a polytheistic religion is attributed to the deities in very degree. Some passages almost seem to appraise the God's intellectual capacity, of clever mind exceeding wise, to whose plans nothing is comparable. But the knowledge of some Assyrian deities is deeper than that, for the gods read the omens and so learn the fates of men and nations for the years. The supreme God is powerful. The wise God is also the powerful God. The Assyrian deities, as well as Yahweh, are preeminently war gods. This fact is established by the astonishingly large number of references to their war activities. In these examples, to establish the fact that they are warriors, there are many references to Yahweh as warrior. His warlike titles are given in Psalms 24. Yahweh, strong and mighty. Yahweh, mighty in battle. Yahweh of hosts, he is the King of glory. There's plenty more here. The Assyrian hymns emphasize the impossibility of escape from the sight and power of the God. Thy glance, who avoids it? Thy attack, who escapes it? There is an incomparably finer conception of God's omnipresence and omniscience in Psalms 139:7-12. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up unto heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in Sheol, that's the grave, therefore thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall overwhelm me, and the light about me shall be night, even the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. So no matter where you are, wherever you go, wherever you try to hide, he's there. Wherever you end up, he's there. The supreme God is merciful. The wise and powerful God is also the merciful one, for mercy is an attribute of the Assyrian deities as of Yahweh. Assyrian usage supports the view that the poor and the needy of the Psalms and the barren woman of Psalms 113 are not to be interpreted as a Jewish nation, but as individuals. Yahweh, says the psalmist, is the incomparable God, and that from his glorious seat in the heavens he bendeth low to help the needy upon the earth. More examples there. Assyrian usage supports the view that the poor and the needy of the Psalms and the barren woman of Psalms 113 are not to be interpreted as a Jewish nation, but as individuals. Yahweh, says the psalmist, is the incomparable God, and that from his glorious seat in the heavens he bendeth low to help the needy upon earth. Assyrian usage supports the view that the poor and the needy of the Psalms and the barren woman of Psalms 113 are not to be interpreted as a Jewish nation, but as individuals. Yahweh, says the psalmist, is the incomparable God, in that from his glorious seat in the heavens he bendeth low to help the needy upon the earth. Yahweh is elsewhere in the Old Testament the father of the Hebrew nation, Hosea, and the father of the Messiah, Psalm 2. But in the hymn he is not actually called father, though his compassion is likened to that of a father for his children. Like as a father pitieth his children, so Yahweh pitieth those who fear him, for he indeed knoweth our frame, he remembered that we are dust. The supreme God is king and judge. The final significance and supreme importance of deity for Assyrian and Hebrew hymnists is perhaps best summed up in the words king and judge. To be sure, the person in sickness of any kind could and did have recourse to the God who had wisdom and power to work deliverance. But even as the life of the Assyrian and Hebrew peoples revolved around the earthly king upon his throne, so they sought for authority and leadership, protection and prosperity in a heavenly king whose right it was to reign in heaven and on earth. It is not strange then that many Assyrian hymns do homage to the deity as King of heaven and earth. King of Kings, exalted, whose decrees none rival. King of Kings occurs only here in the Assyrian hymns. It is a title that would come naturally into use where city kings were compelled to pay homage to royal founders of empires. Turning to the biblical hymns, it is noteworthy that while Yahweh is spoken of several times as the maker of heaven and earth, he is nowhere called King of heaven and earth. This would be such an appropriate title for Yahweh that its absence tends to indicate that there was little verbal borrowing of Hebrew hymnists from the Assyrians. Reference is made, however, in the biblical hymns to Yahweh's throne. Yahweh hath established his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom ruleth over all. Psalms 103 verse 19, which is quite similar to the following passage from hymn to sin number 2, that's in the Assyrian. In powerful sovereignty thou rulest the lands, thou placest on the glittering heavens thy throne. In both cases the throne, 1 is in heaven, 2 is established by deity himself, and 3 is the seat from which wide sovereignty is exerted over the earth. God reigneth over the nations, he sitteth upon his holy throne. One is tempted to translate this, he sitteth upon the throne of a sanctuary, which is parallel to the following passage from hymn to Nib number 7, when he sits upon the great throne of the holy chamber. This translation is supported by Psalms 151. Praise God in the sanctuary. There are 2 references to the throne in the biblical hymns. Established is thy throne of old. Righteousness and justice are the establishment of his throne. In both Assyrian and Hebrew hymns, the ascension to the throne is referred to as a joyous occasion. God has gone up with a shout, Yahweh with the sound of a trumpet. The supreme God is judge. Kingship also implied judgeship, the latter word having particular application to the rendering of judicial decisions or the achievements of justice for the oppressed. The actual word judge occurs occasionally in the Assyrian hymns as the title of the deity. Consequently, the God intervenes in earthly affairs to overthrow wickedness and establish righteousness. Yahweh also exercised judgeship. The idea of kingship surely involves that of judgeship with it, and as king it is said of Yahweh, righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. A strong one has become king, he loves justice. Yahweh overthrows wickedness and establishes righteousness. For God is a judge, the one he putteth down, and this one he raiseth up. Man shall say, truly there is a reward for the righteous, verily there is a God who judges in the earth. chapter 15. The conclusion. It is now universally recognized by scholars that the Hebrew nation came late upon the stage of history, and that when the Hebrew Bedouin passed over out of the desert into the land of Canaan, they entered a land that had already experienced millenniums of civilization. In successive decades and centuries, the Hebrew conquerors took over not only the land with its walled cities and its cultivated fields, but they took over also the land's sanctuaries and in large measure its religious and moral ideas. One civilization among others that exerted very great influence for many centuries over Canaan came from the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. It brought to Canaan its language, its literary forms, its myths and legends, its legal statutes. It brought also in some degree the knowledge of its gods and hymns and prayers with which those gods were worshipped. The Hebrews were inevitably directed and indirectly influenced by Assyrian culture and religion. It is of some importance to recognize, although the fact is by no means surprising, that the situations in life out of which the hymnal literatures grew were quite similar in Assyria and in Israel. Okay, so again, one civilization among others that exerted very great influence for many centuries over Canaan came from Tigris-Euphrates, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. It brought to Canaan its language, its literary forms, its myths and legends, its legal statutes. It brought also in some degree the knowledge of its gods and the hymns and prayers with which those gods were worshipped. The Hebrews were inevitably directly and indirectly influenced by Assyrian culture and religion. Well, yeah, I'd say they would be if Abraham, born in Ur of Chaldea, which is in Mesopotamia, which is of Assyria, ventured out into the land of Canaan. If he had came across the tribe of Eber, E-B-E-R, or Heber, H-E-B-E-R, the forefather of the Hebrews, yeah, then I guess that would be true. Because they were heavily influenced by Assyria, because they merged their Aramaic with the Assyrian. It became known as Assyrian Aramaic when there was no Assyrian Aramaic, there's only Assyrian, according to native-born Assyrians. And they had this old scribal tongue, Lishana Artika Sapreya, right, of the Kitab Esher, ancient Kitab Esher. It is of some importance to recognise, although the fact is by no means surprising, that the situations in life out of which the hymnal literatures grew were quite similar to Assyria and Israel. Both peoples had a certain number of hymns, which can best be characterised as nature hymns, but both people had also hymns which belong very clearly to the sanctuary. Some of these are processional hymns, procession bringing the god to a sanctuary, as in Psalm 24, and hymn to Marduk number 13, and so forth. Moreover, Israel undoubtedly found in the old civilization much of its hymnal phraseology and many of its basic religious ideas. However, this certainty does not mean that the Hebrews were merely passive recipients of Assyrian culture. They did obviously take over certain literary forms and devices, but they created a new and distinct type of hymn, which begins and ends with the exhortation to praise Yahweh. What is even more important, Hebrew genius has employed such simplicity, variety, beauty and power of expression as to create such masterpieces of literature as Psalms 8, 24, 29, 47, 67, 100, 96 and 150. Again, Israel did undoubtedly take over, as has been indicated, certain basic conceptions of God, but Hebrew religious genius purified and exalted those conceptions. The Assyrian could conceive of one God as supreme among the gods. The Hebrew came to think of Yahweh as the only God, the altogether spiritual being, freed from the contamination of polytheism. The Assyrian exalted his God to the high heavens. The Hebrew emancipated Yahweh from any possibility of identification with sun, moon or star or any natural force. The Assyrian attributed to his God great power to bless or curse. The Hebrew attributed power to Yahweh, but dissociated him from all magical practices or practice. The Assyrian does indeed ascribe to his God righteousness and mercy, but the Hebrew makes righteousness and mercy the essential attributes of Yahweh. In a word, the hymnists of Israel at their highest and their best reflect the influence of the prophets, to which there was nothing comparable in Assyria. One very important fact to be recognised is the emergence of or development of the genuine hymn in Israel. It has been suggested that the great majority of so-called Assyrian hymns are really only hymnal introductions to prayers or ceremonies, and furthermore that there may be well a line of development from the hymnal introduction to the independent hymn. There are two examples of hymnal introduction in the Old Testament: Psalter, Psalms 89 and 144, and there is some justification for selected Psalms 104 and 8. 104 is supposed to be said to have been the ode to Aton. Okay, I've seen it in a church hymnal that I used to attend. I just happened to look and found it in there. Psalms 104 and 8 as hymns which represent the completion of the process of development. Praise has thus attained to a much greater place in the Hebrew religion than in the religion of Assyria. Praise is no longer subordinate to any other goal. It has become an end in itself, profitable to man and pleasing to God. The Hebrew religion carries the hymn to its highest pitch of development in the eschatological hymn, which is sung in anticipation of Yahweh's complete and final triumph upon earth. The eschatological hymn owes its origin to the strong national spirit of the Hebrews, the strength of the conviction that a moral order exists in the world, and the faith in Yahweh as far as wise and good and powerful God who will bring justice and righteousness to triumph in the earth. There was in Assyria also, as we have seen, the thought of God as exalted king, but the Assyrians never attained to the conception of God establishing complete and final ethical sovereignty over the earth. A study of the Assyrian psalm is value for the Old Testament student in widening his field of knowledge and thus saving him from the danger of setting up false standards. It is enlightened for him to observe in the Assyrian hymns the very frequent fact of irregularity in the length of lines, in the number of lines, in the strophe, in the type of parallelism it employed. This suggests that often it may be variety and not uniformity that the poet is seeking, and that extreme caution ought to be observed in altering the Hebrew text to make it conform to a Western conception of order and regularity. One is impressed also by the prominence of the individual in the Assyrian hymn and in the Assyrian cult, and is thus warned against the highly artificial assumption that the individual of the Hebrew Psalms is a personification of the Hebrew nation. The individual may well have played a much larger part in the early religion of Israel than has been commonly supposed. The study of the Assyrian hymns will have value at various other points. The consideration of the place of the refrains, the antiphonal renderings, the divine oracles will help understand the use of the hymn in the Hebrew cult. Acquaintance with the Assyrian hymnal phraseology will undoubtedly be of assistance in the interpretation and clearer understanding of many phrases in the Hebrew hymns. The Assyrian hymns make, however, their indispensable contribution in that practically all the religious ideas of the Hebrew hymns exist in cruder form in the Assyrian hymns. They help us to reconstruct the polytheistic background of the Hebrew religion. They leave us with a clearer perception that Yahweh was primarily a God of heaven, and with a fuller knowledge of just what that means. They help us to understand the prominence given to the attributes of Yahweh as a mighty God. They prove the antiquity of the conception of God as king and judge, shepherd and father. They reflect crude and crass ideas of the divine wisdom, power and mercy. Against the background of the Assyrian hymns, one gains a just appreciation of the developed Hebrew doctrine of God, the omnipresent, the omniscient, the omnipotent, whose eternal plan is to be fulfilled, who will cause truth and righteousness to prevail in the earth, who is to be universally and eternally adored. There's a bibliography, text and translations of Assyrian hymns, hymns to Shamash, these are all the references, hymns to Sin, hymns to Nebo, Ninib, Negral, hymns to Adad, etc., etc. Hymn to Asher, and so forth. These are selected by bibliography. Footnotes. Indexes, so you can tell who is who in the Assyrian and Hebrew, or what certain words mean.